Good morning. I wonder if you as a family do what we do sometimes. We say something like, do you remember that? Or something happens that reminds us. We've been going through photographs recently, photographs of back from 1988 when we returned to India with our little daughter, as she was then, Becky. And we came across a photograph of her somewhere around, I think, the Taj Mahal. Do you remember that? You know, it's passing through fields at the moment behind me that you can see are fields my dad used to farm when he was young. And, he remembers stories. And do you remember that? We've been doing the Easter story together. And there are so many incidents in the Easter story that trigger memories. You remember the story, Jesus is risen from the dead and he has appeared to his disciples and Thomas wasn't there. And then the second week Thomas was there. And now they hear the words from Jesus that he was going to go ahead of them into Galilee. And so they head to Galilee. Now why Galilee, you may say? Well, perhaps Jesus, we know, had quite a following there in Galilee. And we know on one occasion, recorded by Paul, he meets 500 witnesses at once to the resurrection, probably in Galilee. But also, is in Galilee that he would get away with his disciples, perhaps for the 40 days before he ascended to heaven, away from the busyness, to spend some time with the disciples, speaking to them and encouraging them. Thirdly, on that journey there to Galilee, perhaps Jesus knew that where they went would trigger memories. And so they head north out of the city. I suspect it's north. They could have gone east and then north via Jericho and up the Jordan Valley. But instead, I'm pretty sure, in my mind anyhow, they headed north out of Jerusalem. You see, in the past, they would never have gone that route. But Jesus had taught them not to be prejudiced against the Samaritans. It took 3 days going that route via the Samaritans, 5 days the other way. So Jesus had taught them that lesson. So I'm pretty sure in my mind they headed north out of Jerusalem on that road to Samaria. Now, as they head up north and head in that direction, along the way they would have seen things like a rock or a building or a tree. And they would have nudged one another perhaps and said, do you remember Jesus telling this story? Do you remember that? You know, remember, John is telling these stories and he's chosen highlights because he knows, he says, that at the end of John's Gospel, almost the last few verses, he says, all the books in the world wouldn't contain all the stories about Jesus. And so they pass by all these different triggers to their memories. They come to a place, and I'm pretty sure in my mind, I can't prove it, but they came to Sychar, the place where Jesus had met in John chapter 4, that woman at the well. And so that's one of his favourites, John, as he recounts that, maybe 45 years later, as he recounts the story of what happened in John chapter 4. And maybe on this north journey to Galilee, he comes across that place. And if they had, or if they do, then I'm pretty sure they would have called in and stopped at the village and maybe had a conversation and shared with the disciples, those who had believed in Jesus in John chapter 4, and told them of the resurrection of Jesus and told them what had happened since. So as they stop, perhaps they're there in Sychar. Maybe they've gone in and had a meal. And as they've had a meal, as they've taken food together, as they've taken bread and they've taken wine together, it would have triggered memories, triggered remembrances of what they should remember and the one that they should remember. And maybe they got into conversation there with the woman, and maybe she recounted again the story, because John will record it years later, and she would tell them of how Jesus met her and offered her living water, a life that was changed forever because of Jesus. And as she tells that story again about that living water and the deep need of her life, perhaps the disciples remember the other words that Jesus had said. When Jesus said, when he saw the crowd coming out to hear the stories of the woman had said, and that she wanted to recount them and they wanted to hear, Jesus would have said, my nourishment is doing the will of God, the one who sent me and finishing his work. You know, as they press north out of Sychar, heading north towards Nazareth or slightly northeast towards Tiberias at the bottom of the Sea of Galilee, maybe the words of Jesus ring in their minds. Maybe, just maybe, they get fresh nourishment themselves and encouragement themselves as they remember the words of Jesus. not only do they get nourishment by finishing his work, but also they get nourishment from God's word as they seek to do the will of God in the ups and downs of life that lie ahead of them and lie ahead of us too. We need also God's nourishment from the soul, or for the soul daily, and nourished by the fact that he's finished his work. It is finished. He's finished all the Father sent him to do. But also to be challenged too, because Jesus had said to them on that same occasion, he said, the fields are white to harvest and the labourers are few. As we labour and serve him and worship him today, let life at its simplest form remind you and trigger memories in you. Water as you drink it, he's the living water of life. Bread as you eat it, he's the bread of life. A sheep maybe on the fields as you see it, he is the good shepherd. Let these triggers of him bring the richness of his goodness and go with God today. May God bless you.